Well, on the flip side of the blue, there is the outline review of what we went through last week. So we did talk a lot about Sodom and Lot and the three visitors, which is really I feel like one of the coolest passages in the Bible. Just how Abraham reacted to them. I mean, he thought for sure they were, and then all of a sudden somehow he said, whoa, wait a minute. When they start calling him Abram, he's never met him before, and then of course when he says, Sarah's gonna have a baby, and all of that. And then of course he has the conversation with God about Sodom. God knowing that, he says, I'm not gonna withhold this from my friend, Abram. Why? Well, partly why, because he knew that Abraham loved Lot. And Lot had been, kind of a prodigal in a lot of ways. I mean, he was like his son. And he had warned Lot about things, and he didn't take his advice. Now, that sounds familiar to many of you with relatives or friends or offspring, where, and I said last week too, Abraham we don't have record of him seeing Lot after Sodom was destroyed. But if he had, I'm sure Abraham would never have said, I told you so. I mean, and that would have ruined the relationship for sure if he had. Lot already knew. Lot's life was in the pits at that point. And he drops off history. We don't know what happened to Lot when he died. He remarried. We don't know. I mean, he was, in those days, he was a fairly young man. He was probably in his 50s, which seems young today, right? So, the angels go to Sodom. Lot escapes. He literally has to the angels have to grab him by the scruff of the neck and say, we're going. And of course, and one of the things too, just by reading that passage, you would think Lot was a real loser. But Peter had a different perspective. Peter said that he was a righteous man, and he was sick of the shameful immorality in Sodom and Gomorrah. So, but he didn't make a big influence, and that's the sad part, even though he had risen to elder of the city. And it is one of the stories you don't talk about, in children's Sunday school, for good reason. And then of course that's the origin of Moab and Ammon, and that has lasting consequences for centuries afterwards. Remember, Moab was the one that hired Balaam to curse Israel when they were coming into the land. So then we talked about Abraham goes to Abimelech, who was a Philistine warlord, or king, quote unquote, and he saw Sarah, and he said, okay, you bring her here, she's now in my harem. And he did that in good conscience. He thought she was single. I mean, she was in her 80s. And Abraham had apparently probably made a pact with Sarah, saying, when we come into these strange lands, and you just say you're my sister, because after all, you're my half sister, which is weird, anyways. But you'd think he would have remembered that it was not pleasing to God in Egypt, but he did it again.
The extreme makeover God edition hadn't arrived yet.
Right, yeah. And remember that, the sins of the parents are visited upon the children. And we see Isaac doing the same thing years later. with Rebekah. With, it's not the same Abimelech, I think that was kind of a title type of thing, like Pharaoh, but it was also an Abimelech.
Don't take a
that
picture of
wanted
me, though. I'm
Rebekah.
gonna be a
And
bad-
Rebekah was quite the gal too. And, but, you know, everything was hanging in the balance. God was not going to let anything happen to Sarah in this situation. And it was a pretty dangerous situation for Sarah. And then, you know, Abimelech has the dream, and he's conversing with God. He's saying, "What do you mean? I didn't know, you know, I'm innocent." And God said, "I know. So give her back, and then give Abraham a whole bunch of stuff, and pray, and he'll pray for you." You know, you'd think of Abimelech, and I'm sure he was mad. "Why didn't you tell me?" He says, "Well, you know, this is a heathen country, you know, I thought you were a bad guy." It wasn't a great Christian testimony. So.
It's a testimony that God is good.
Right, yeah, that God was going to fulfill his covenant with Abraham no matter what. And then now Isaac arrives, and we're going to get into today what that meant for Ishmael and Hagar, and then how Paul talks about the symbolism and the analogy of those two children. It doesn't seem right in our way of thinking, but Ishmael had to go. So, we're going to start out first though too where, if you want to turn to Genesis 21, we're going to be through Genesis 21 and 22 today. And then we'll get into hopefully a little bit of Genesis 23. So once again, he's close by with Abimelech, and he makes a covenant with Abimelech, the Philistine king, and Philco, the commander of his armed forces. So Abimelech and Philco see that, boy, Abraham's really, he's got it made here. Man, he's really rich and prosperous. Everything kind of goes right for him. And I think they want a piece of the action. You know, they're saying, hey, you know, what can we do to get this through? Now, the man is obviously very powerful and not to be taken lightly. He's probably got a standing army behind him. And they were Philistines. And in the future, of course, Philistines are the sworn enemies of Israel, which we're going through in Sunday school on David. And so they make a covenant with each other. And that was a big thing back in those days. Two men, two leaders would make a covenant, and they were bound by that. It wasn't like, I'm going to go get a lawyer downtown and break it, you know, break the contract. You didn't do that. And I'm not sure if they did the cutting type of thing that we talked about that was common. It doesn't say, but they did make a covenant. Now, they had a well, and wells were big deals back then, because wells were prosperity. If you had a well, you could water your sheep and flocks, and it was a fairly dry place. So there was a dispute between the herdsmen of each. And the well was later named Beersheba, which is a familiar Bible name, and it meant well of oath. And they shared that well then, apparently, and Abraham planted a tamarisk tree, which is known to be a very hardy tree in dry areas. Tamarisk, maybe Jim knows this, were imported to the United States.
Right.
Yeah, and they became kind of a invasive species.
Down south. They
Yeah.
don't, they don't quite make it up here.
No. And
Is it an evergreen tree? Is that what it is?
it looks like
It looks like one, but it's not.
Yeah. And when I was in Dinosaur National Monument, there's a river that flows through, and they have a lot of cottonwoods that go right by the river, and every place else is pretty arid. But tamarisk trees had been overgrown in that area, and they'd have crews of people coming in and cutting down the tamarisk trees to get rid of them, because they were sheltering the young little cottonwoods. Said they couldn't get enough light and they'd kill them off. Anyways, little botanical satellite there. So tamarisk.
Are they something like tamaracks?
No,
No.
no.
Oh,
So, and like you said, I don't think they would prosper here, would they? Oh,
We're on the northern limit.
yeah, okay. So, but one thing that shows here with Abimelech is it showed how Abraham was willing to be a good neighbor and to make peace with his neighbors. He wasn't going to say, hey, I'm going to take that well, God's with me, not with you. And that was a good testimony there. I'm not sure if it's the same Abimelech that before tried to take his wife. Like I said, I think it was a title more than a person per se. Well, now we come to kind of the big moment of the life of Abraham. Now, God has given progressive revelation all along. And so in Haran, he promised him he'd be a great nation. In Bethel, he said, your offspring would be as the dust of the earth. In Mamre, he said, your offspring are going to be like the stars of the sky. And it would include, of course, the new covenant of faith. Would include, it was expanded, it's going to be nations and kings will come from you. Now, he referred to the land. He said it was going to be an everlasting possession. And then it referred to the coming child. Sarah shall bear you a son indeed, and you shall call his name Isaac. And remember, Hagar and Ishmael would not do. To see how much Abraham really loved Ishmael. Whenever the subject is brought up, it seems like he's saying, can't Ishmael do? Or what about Ishmael? What's going to happen to him? He had invested, before Isaac was born, Ishmael was probably 14, 15 years old. And he had invested, he'd been his father there, just training him in all the things of how to survive in the desert, and he loved him. And it doesn't really indicate that, Ishmael was really a big problem child. So it's very hurtful now what happens next. And
Could I ask a question?
yeah,
It said that Lot was really against, and here his two girls messed with him, and just think, he knew those were his two kids then, right? The children of his daughter were his. I mean, so here he did something that he never would have ever intended on doing,
right. I mean, it was partly the result of them being in that culture that they would even think that was okay.
Oh,
Yeah. And like I said, we don't know what happened a lot afterwards. Maybe he went off to live with one of the daughters, and they went off someplace. We don't know. I don't know if Josephus or, ever says anything about that. But so this is the big test. Now, J. Vernon McGee says that this chapter 22 is one of the 10 greatest chapters in the whole Bible, which is a big statement. And the story foreshadows Christ's coming and death. We're to see the little clip here in just a minute. I want you to think of when this was happening, what is Sarah thinking of the events? She was probably thinking, what in the world is Abraham up to today? So I think we will, what I want to show first is I think we'll put them kind of together here. We're going to show when Sarah and Abraham kind of have a tent talk, so they're in the tent and Sarah's kind of unloading on Abraham about Ishmael and Hagar. It's not in the Bible, acknowledged, but it doesn't seem totally unbiblical. And I mentioned some of that last time, how she's thinking, you know what, we're getting old. What's going to happen to Isaac after he's born? Okay.
That is, should this... Every man in the tribe is now ready to follow Ishmael into the teeth of death. He's so much older than us, but he's headstrong.
That there guy. So, kind of a, dramatized theatrical license there, but like I said, I feel like it's not unbiblical what happened there. And the other thing is just how God said he would take care of Ishmael.
Yes.
And that he was a prodigal too, but God was going to take care of him. So, and he did. Same angel that went to Sodom. If you notice the face there. We don't know what angel it was or whether it was, the angel of the Lord, which was an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament. Any comments on that part? And, I had never thought of the thing where Sarah's saying, because it makes sense. If Ishmael sticks around and we're gone, what's to prevent Hagar and Ishmael from taking the reins and saying, we're the blessing, we're the number one. And it wasn't unusual in those days, right, to sell your birthright? So, which later on, of course, happens in other situations. Okay. And the little thing about the lamb wasn't in the Bible either, but it kind of foreshadows what's happening here. Now, Scripture says that he was at least 15 years old. He was, some say, even 30 when this happened. He's not a little boy.
That I want every day I have to prepare.
Okay, well, that's a pretty moving. I mean, like I've said many times, Richard Harris is a good actor.
Yes.
Now, one thing there, they portray him, which is usually in Sunday school material too, as a young boy, younger than that. Like I said, at least he's 15. J. Vernon McGee says that he thinks he's in his 30s. Regardless, he is very able to run away from an old man or to overpower him and say, no way. I thought the way they portrayed it where very moving, where he says, tie it tight. He was in on the deal. So, like I said, it was, they obviously, it made it look like it was shorter than it was, a 3-day journey. I like the way they have Sarah coming out of the tent. I don't think she knew what was going on. Otherwise, I think she would have, no, you're not taking him. I don't know. But,
Ask mothers now.
yeah, and she would have, like I said, she's probably thinking, what is the old guy up to today?
According to my Bible, in the commentary, It says that the place where he was made this sacrifice was actually what became Jerusalem.
Right. Yeah.
I had never heard that before.
Yeah, oh, yeah, and that, it's Moriah, there's kind of a ridge apparently. Part of that ridge is Golgotha. Part of it is where the temple is built, which is really symbolic that it was Golgotha.
Symbolism in this first part, because then I had underlined something there another time, and was thinking about, here's Abraham, like God, was sacrificing his son.
You're right.
He did. And there were 3 days.
Yes, and the 3 days is
3 days.
symbolic too.
Yeah, right up there. And then he was put, and it wasn't the cross, but the altar
Mhm.
was there.
Right,
And in this case, we were saved,
right.
not him.
Right. And it was very significant too, which was biblical, where he tells the two servants, he says, and we will come back.
Yeah.
He knew, even if he had to sacrifice him, that God was going to raise him from the dead. Because he believed that promise so much that he was the son of promise. He had not had any offspring yet. He didn't have any grandkids yet. J. Vernon McGee says, he certainly died on the same ridge, the same mountain in which Abraham offered Isaac. And to offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell you of. The burnt offering was the offering up until the time of the Mosaic law, when a sin offering and a trespass offering were given. Here the burnt offering speaks of the person of Christ, who is he. This is an offer of human sacrifice, and frankly it raises moral questions. Isn't human sacrifice wrong? Yes, it is morally wrong. Had you met Abraham on that day when he was on his way with Isaac, you might have asked, where are you going, Abraham? And he would have replied, to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And you would have asked, don't you know that is wrong? Abraham would have said, yes, I've been taught that is wrong. I know that heathen nations around here offer human sacrifice. But I have been taught otherwise. Would you then question him further? Then why are you doing it? And he would explain, all I know is that God has commanded it. I don't understand it, and I've been walking with him for 50 years. He has never failed me, nor has he asked me to do anything that did not prove to be the best thing. I don't understand, but I believe that if I go all the way with him, that God will raise Isaac from the dead. I believe that he will do that. This is a tremendous picture as Abraham takes Isaac with him. And, you know, the symbolism there, like we've been hinting at, pretty clear. And F.B. Meyer wrote about this. God's calls are not always accompanied by reasons, but they are always accompanied by promises, expressed or understood. And we can understand the promise even though the reason might baffle or confuse us. And most all of you have lived long enough to know that that's true. Some analogies. So both were the only son. Both Christ and Isaac obeyed their father. Isaac carried the wood as Christ carried the cross. That was really symbolic.
That's a good quote.
Yeah. Calvary and Moriah were in the same area, if not the same site. Moriah was also the site of Solomon's temple. God will provide the land for the offering. And that key, you know, another name for God, Jehovah Jireh. God provides. God showed the doctrine of substitution, how life can be preserved only at the cost of a life given. Abraham believed that God was able to raise him from the dead. Remember, Isaac was 15, some say 30, not a little child, and could have easily run away. Just like, you know, Jesus could have said no. And then when he says, we will return, he knew that God would even raise him from the dead. What were the servants thinking? They're probably a little puzzled too, you know. He brought the wood. Where's the, you know? Isaac asked, "Where is the sacrifice?" And the famous reply, "God will supply, God will provide." And then the angel of the Lord calls out at the last minute, which sometimes God does, right? He answers our prayer at the last minute. Now, a lot of people think it was an angel of the Lord, which is a Christ appearance in the Old Testament. So the blessings continue to be expanded. If God had asked him to do it, something like this back in Ur, Abraham wasn't ready. But like he said, I walked with the Lord 50 years. He has never, he has never failed me. And then the seed, he says, in your seed, all nations will be blessed. And of course, the seed, singular, is Christ. And like, even from in the Garden of Eden, after the sin, he said the seed of the woman. Yeah.
Abraham knew God's voice really well, okay? But if the voice comes and tells you to do something that the culture does, do you know what I'm saying, for him, that could have been Satan. I mean, I would have thought, this is Satan this time, this isn't God. Because he wanted you to kill your son, which was against everything that God stood for.
Yeah.
So he must have really...
He really knew God.
You know what I'm saying? Because I would have thought that's Satan, impersonating Jesus or God.
Yeah.
To go kill your kid,
Well, Abraham was special, in that sense. Yeah, I mean, right. You're very right, I think, yeah. So, now God said, now I know. The angel said, now I know that you're faithful, that you've been willing to offer your own son. Now James 2:21 says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered his son upon the altar? Now compare that to Romans 4:1-3, where it says, and Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now that seems to be works versus faith. What's the scoop there? Well, Paul is talking about Genesis 15, while James is talking about works of faith. I'm willing to offer his son Isaac. He's talking about Genesis 22. And it was because of his faith he was able to be willing to sacrifice him. So, in my little commentary here, let's see here. So the whole idea that our faith is shown by our works. That's the bottom line there. Let's see. Yeah. Well, in James it says that. Let me see here. But that, remember Martin Luther, he didn't want James, the book of James in the Bible. Because it was, talking about works, and of course the big deal with him was here we go. When Paul used the word justified, he meant saved or declared righteous, whereas James meant vindicated or authenticated by works. Paul meant works of the law, whereas James meant works that faith produce. And that's the key there, and that's how you can kind of put those two together. Martin Luther didn't have that commentary to
children.
But they made a big mistake when they gave Martin Luther the Bible, because everything changed, he changed
Right.
everything, I mean, you know.
Well, the next part is there's news, so they go on Facebook, and they find out that way back in Haran now, the relatives, there's been offspring, that Nahor has 8 children. And I always get a kick out of the two of the sons, named Buzz and Uz. Yeah. And I think, if you ever have twin boys, you should name them Buzz and Uz. And they wouldn't have any trouble in kindergarten writing out their name then, too. Yeah. But it's important that Bethuel has a daughter, and her name is Rebecca. Well, Sarah then dies in Genesis 23. She's 127 years old. That's a pretty good long life. Now, Abraham is 137. So what does he do after she dies?
He gets another
He
wife.
gets another wife, right? Yeah.
I heard that,
Kind of a button for punishment,
Yeah.
isn't
I heard that Sarah's death is the only woman's death that they gave her age. There's no other,
Nobody else older than that, that's listed.
no,
Oh.
that actually, the Bible said how old she was.
Oh,
That was recorded.
well,
No
that's
other-
because you're not supposed to tell them.
Yeah. I stand
Correct.
correct.
That's interesting.
I thought it was really amazing what it said on the screen at the end there. I made me look for it in the Bible, and it's in chapter 25 that Isaac and Ishmael buried Abraham together.
Yeah.
Yeah, that they were, yeah,
Wow,
they weren't enemies,
wow.
at least at that point. Now, so he negotiates a tomb with Heth the Hittite and Ephraim. So these are neighbors. And once again, you know, he really strived to be a good neighbor. And, you know, I read this, it says, this is, so the children say, or the children of Heth say, you're a mighty warrior among us, and in the choice of our sepulchres bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee sepulchres, but thou mayest bury thy dead. You know, they said, you know, hey, you've been a good guy. You know, you take your pick. Now, they're probably saying, take it for free. Abraham knows, I do have to give him something. But this is a very generous offer by the children of Heth who live in the land. They probably said to Abraham, just pick your burying spot. That's it. We'd be delighted to have you. Abraham made a tremendous impression. They called him a mighty prince. The man's influence counted for something. I was thinking, what a contrast with Lot. What did the people of Sodom think of Lot? Not much. Abraham, they thought, he's a good guy. And he didn't push the envelope on saying, hey man, you know, God told me all this land is mine anyway, so just give it to me. You know, he went to them and then he gave them what he thought was, you know, the true value of it. And I'm sure partly it was, you know, some of you have been to Israel, I guess, you know, the way they negotiate in markets, you know, it's like, you know, they're gonna try to negotiate, and so I think he was very generous, and he didn't want him to come back later and say, hey, you know, you never really paid anything for it, so we're gonna use it. So he used that same tomb for himself, and then for, I think, Isaac and Rebekah were buried there as well. So then we get to the bride for Isaac. Isaac is no spring chicken. You know, we think young people marry late nowadays. Well, he's at least around 40 years old. I think he's kind of a mom's boy too. Now, we're in Genesis 24. So Abraham, he says, you are not to get him a bride among the people around here. Now, remember later, Isaac had trouble with that because Esau married a couple of the locals. And it says, it was a grief to Rebekah. And she said to Isaac, she says, Jacob is not going to marry anybody around here. You send him back to Haran and find somebody from our relatives. Well, their relatives weren't all that great either. I mean, Laban was a crook, and we'll get into that another time. But so Eliezer, who was slated, remember originally, he would have been the guy that would inherit everything if he didn't have a son. Eliezer must have been a really good guy too. And he makes Eliezer promise to not take him back, but to find a wife for him from his kin and bring the wife to where they were. He didn't want Isaac to leave the land because he knew what would happen. He gets back there, and Laban's there, and Laban would have said, oh no, you're going to stay, So they recognized he was obviously trusted and reliable. And then, verse 14 in chapter 24 is very interesting. Eliezer makes out a specific prayer, and he puts out a fleece. There are places in the Bible where fleeces are okay. Often we do a fleece if it's something, we don't really want to do, But he said, if I want you to show me the right gal. And sure enough, it was a big deal because Abraham's lineage was in the balance. And when he prayed, he said, the gal that comes out and waters the camels and everything. And before he was done speaking, God answered. The Amplified Bible describes Rebekah as, remember the Amplified goes, all the adjectives. Her beautiful, attractive, chaste, modest, single, she's polite, and she offers him a drink. And Eliezer's going, she's the one.
This isn't hard to figure out.
This isn't hard to figure out. And obviously a hard worker. She offers to water all the camels. You might think, well, that's not too big of a deal. It was a big deal. I know somebody said, the camels, it says they drink somewhere between 140 and 250 gallons by the time they are through. Each camel.
And there was 10 camels.
And there was more than 10, and there was 10 camels, because they were bringing all the loot too, all the dowry. And the scripture does read, until they had finished drinking. So this is not just a sip. Also, the next text tells us that Rebekah descended to get the water, so there must have been even steps to climb down to the spring. If the spring or well had been easily accessible, they could simply lead the camels to the water. But instead, a trough was used. It's likely it took her hours to perform the task. In short, Rebekah volunteered for the task for a complete stranger, but soon she would be richly rewarded. The watering of the camels in and of itself is a sign to the servant for certain. Hospitality was a big deal back then. About Abraham, when the strangers came, or Melchizedek came. So this is interesting. So he gave her bracelets and a nose ring. So when your granddaughter comes home with a nose ring, don't be too upset. And Laban saw what this guy had, and he said, let's negotiate here. And then when he finds out also she's the daughter of Bethuel, Eliezer worships God. What a show of God's providence. I mean, God was behind all of this all along. And then Laban starts wheeling and dealing. Eliezer gets right to the point. I'm not gonna be distracted. I'm not gonna wait around here. She's gotta go back with me. And then he said, well, why don't you wait 10 more days? He thought, well, maybe I'll get more money. And then he said, well, we'll ask her. And he said, Rebecca, will you go with this man? She said, yep. I mean, that was pretty brave too. I mean, she doesn't know what Isaac's like.
Yeah.
Complete strangers.
Yeah.
Maybe she didn't want to water the camels again.
Yeah. And then when she gets back there, it is love at first sight. And Isaac is at the well when he sees her, and the well is called the well of the living one who sees me. And then, like we said, Abraham dies, he's remarried, he gives gifts to the 6 children he had with Keturah and Ishmael, but the birthright to Isaac. And he lived 175 years, 38 years after Sarah died. So Isaac and Ishmael, like we said in the movie, which was correct, they bury him in the cave that he bought for Sarah. So some things we can learn real quick. What we must do. We must hear God's voice. We must obey immediately. With every encounter with God, you must build an altar. You must learn to wait on God to direct your steps when an unexpected crisis comes upon you. You must accept correction from God and return to your relationship of trust when you fail. Anticipate that God will reveal more of himself to trust you. If you're faithful in little, he will give you more. Be ready to step out in faith in the greater revelation of him. And that's what happened in Abraham's life, little by little, until you got to the end. I mean, like, offering your son on an altar. So it was progressive revelation, and that was certainly part. And McGee says too that often we don't give Abraham credit enough. We think, well, he was kind of ignorant of all of this, But what did Jesus say? I saw, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. That Abraham probably had more of a concept of what was coming. Maybe God had revealed him more than we see in the Bible. He rejoiced to see my day and saw it. And God is not the God of the dead. He's the God of the living. Right.
Okay, then that second wife, did she live all along with Abraham?
It doesn't say. We don't know what happened to her.
Oh,
She went on Social Security. I would think probably Isaac took her in. Wouldn't you think? I mean, that would have been a family thing to do. Yeah.
But she had kids too.
She had kids too. Maybe she went with them off to the land of Nod or whatever. Or went to see us and Buzz. Okay. Well, thank you for coming. So next week we will start Noah. And Noah's quite the guy too. All these guys are quite the guys.
They're human.
They're human.